Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's session on the UAE's rapidly evolving climate compliance landscape. One quick note before I dive into my intro. One of our panelists is having a little technical difficulty and should be joining us momentarily. While we're waiting for Prakar to join, I will tee up today's discussion. So today we'll be discussing the Federal Decree Law number 11 on the reduction of climate change effects, which took place on May 30th, 2025. This landmark legislation activates mandatory climate governance responsibilities across the UAE. It requires all entities, including those in free zones, to monitor, measure, report, manage greenhouse gas emissions, also GHG emissions, as part of their national efforts towards achieving net zero by 2050. Tying into the theme of the webinar series, Vision ESG 50. Also, one thing to note is this first reporting will be due a year after it became effective, so that will be in May 30th, 2026. This law introduces regulatory enforcement. Non-compliance with reporting and action plan obligations can result in significant fines ranging from 50,000 AED to 2 million AED, with steeper penalties for repeat violations. This is a major shift in ESG, officially transitioning from voluntary to mandatory across UAE business operations. Now, to help us unpack what this means in practice, we have an outstanding panel with us today. Leading off the charge is Swati Randev. She's an accomplished sustainability ESG leader with extensive experience designing, implementing climate change strategies in multinational environments. Her deep understanding of regulatory transitions and corporate decarbonization strategies will give us a real-world view of what readiness looks like and how to prepare. Swati comes with over a decade of experience serving as the APAC lead for ESG and sustainability for Novo Nordisk. Also joining our panel is, I'm going to skip Prakar right now, and we're going to go to Karantaj Singh. Karan is the founder of Breathe ESG, which is a carbon accounting platform enabling companies to collect high quality ESG data, calculate carbon emissions, automate compliance driven reporting, and much more. Karan brings a technology and capability building perspective, especially important as companies move towards a more robust and data-driven systems. Our last panelist is Prakar Gupta. Prakar leads InCorp's ESG advisory division. He's an ESG and governance specialist. He's focused on risk mitigation, compliance alignment, and integrating sustainability into core business strategies. His insights will help us understand what boards and leadership teams must prioritize to stay ahead of regulatory expectations and to mitigate risk. I'm Colin Connors. I'm joining all of you from Southern California. It's very late here, but I'm happy to be here. I work as a strategic advisor with climate tech startup companies, and I'm helping to unify multi-stack solutions and multi-jurisdictional regulations to bring more robust and easier to incorporate solutions to companies like you. So hopefully this will be informative. Hopefully you guys will take away a lot of new knowledge and wisdom. And more importantly, I hope you guys reach out to these experts that are here today and lean on them as you guys move into this mandatory part of the reporting. So throughout today's webinar, we're going to explore three big themes. One, what exactly does the law require? Super important to know that where you're starting from. Two, what are the operational and data implications for companies like yours? And three, how do organizations convert compliance pressures into competitive advantages? Before we begin, this is designed to be interactive, so please keep that in mind. There's an opportunity for you to click onto the Q&A button. I think on yours it might be at the top, on mine it's at the bottom. Either way, there's a little tab that says Q&A. You can write your question. If it's just a general question, just write a question. If you want one of the panelists to speak on it, please indicate their name. And then we will address that at the end of today's discussion. So with that, thank you for joining us. I don't know how many of you are here, but I know there's several. We're very excited. So let's dive right in. So diving right in, we're going to start off with Swati. So Swati is our first speaker today. Swati, from your experience leading sustainability at a global level, what do you feel is the single biggest shift with the UAE companies should expect as ESG becomes mandatory under Federal Decree Law number 11?
First of all, hi. Thanks, Colin. Thanks for that introduction. Super excited to be here today. I think the UAE is going through this massive transition, and I think the world over, we're seeing a substantial amount of transition in the sustainability and ESG space. And what we're seeing with the UAE Climate Law, with the Federal Decree number 11, is the is setting essentially the foundation of what this will look like in the next few years, right? Adding that piece of accountability. I think the largest shift that we've seen on the back of this decree is sustainability moving from a sort of good to have function to almost a mandatory function. However, what's interesting here is that mandate is not limited to just the reporting piece of it. So it's not, again, sustainability has often been considered a reporting function as opposed to a strategic function. But with this decree, we can see that the governance now will sit with the board, which means that there's a higher accountability. Data governance becomes quite central. And I think that's a shift that's quite essential for companies that operate within the UAE. Now, if we look at the big multinationals, they've had this structure for many, many years. And I go ahead and say perhaps even decades, depending upon what company and what geography that they operate in from a headquarter perspective, right? So the large multinational have operated in this fashion for quite some time, but it's the smaller organizations that perhaps needed a little bit more of a nudge. They needed a little bit more of a guidance in terms of how to get there and how to make sure that sustainability isn't just a tick in the box anymore, isn't just a reporting function anymore, but actually sits in a very strategic position with the board. So I think, in my opinion, that is the biggest shift that we're seeing on the back of this decree.
Wonderful, thank you. So what do you believe companies must prioritize as they're getting ready for annual GHG reporting, like from a reality standpoint?
Yeah, that's a great question, Colin. I think it's also important because the awareness around what this means for companies isn't as mature in the UAE as it is perhaps in some other parts of the world. And so this kind of guidance is super important. Now, in my experience, I think what I would recommend companies, however big or small you are, I would say you need to, first and foremost, at the very beginning, create a baseline of where you stand. So a lot of companies have a 2019 baseline. And when I say this, I mean, when we report on GHG emissions, be it scope 1, 2, or 3, when we start looking at decarbonization strategies, we need to have a decarbonization strategy against a baseline of data from a particular year. Oftentimes, it is 2019. So we look at pre-COVID numbers, the normal that was pre-COVID. Certain companies look at a 22 baseline. But it just really depends upon where you stand with that. So I would say the first thing for companies to do would be to create that baseline. And what I mean by that is start getting your scope 1, your scope 2, and your scope 3 emissions in order, which means take stock count of what that is. So what do your emissions in scope 1, 2, and 3 look like? I think that for me is is step number one. And that's going to be paramount in defining where the company goes, right? And how compliant it is with the decree. The next, I would say, I mean, there's a little bit of conversation that's happening about the complexity of a number of different standardized reporting protocols. And we're seeing that conversation happen in Europe, right? At this point in time. We're expecting legislation to come out in the next few days, which will then help kind of bring all of it together, simplify that, as opposed to kind of figuring out which compliance you want to, which protocol you want to align with. So I would say these protocols also differ basis the industry that you operate within. So understand what industry that you're operating within is, and what protocol that you want to align with. So understand what that is. Also get a standardized data collection protocol in place. So how do you collect your data? Who's responsible? Add accountability to that data. So if your utility bills go into your HR function, then are they accountable? It goes into your finance department. Are they accountable? Do you have a standalone sustainability function? And a lot of companies may or may not have that, and that's perfectly fine. I think with sustainability and on the back of this decree, I think what we're seeing more and more is shared accountability on sustainability. It's not just a Swati who does this twice a year or once a year or once a quarter. This has to be a shared accountability. I think so that's something that they need to establish who is responsible for which piece.
Yeah.
The other thing that I would say is paramount at this stage is to understand what carbon accounting tools are at your disposal. So what's out there? What is a digitized tool that you can onboard for your company to make that process substantially more fluid in the long run? So it's not we're not talking about Excel sheets anymore, right? We've got substantially more mature digital platforms that will do that for us, and I think it's important to identify what's out there, what works best for you. And I think the last couple of things that I will add, which are relevant but also might not be considered as critical by some companies but continue to be very critical, is the assurance piece of it. So there's an audit element within the decree, and I think that assurance is quite critical. Now, these digital tools that I'm talking about often have this integrated within the system that facilitates the audit to happen a little bit more fluidly. So I would say kind of have a look at that, potentially even conduct a mock audit, right? To speak to your internal auditors. If you are a slightly mid-sized company and have an internal auditor, speak to them, see how they can help you through this. Because also financial audits and non-financial audits are extremely difficult. And very, not difficult, sorry. What I mean is they're extremely different. And oftentimes auditors struggle, excuse me, with anything that's non-financial. So kind of have those open conversations, reach out to people, understand what that means. And lastly, which I would kind of arguably put right at the top of that list, would be upskill your teams. Help them understand what this entire process means and how this translates to them more than anything else, as opposed to, oh, this is an Excel sheet. Can you fill in this information and then let's report it? I think we need to go beyond that. And for that, there needs to be a substantial amount of upskilling. So kind of invest in that for your team as well.
Thank you, Swati. That was amazing. That's a lot to unpack, but luckily we're going to have four big topics to discuss next to help transition through that and kind of make it make more sense. But one big takeaway for me was definitely don't wait till the last moment to get ready. So that's good advice for everyone here today. So thank you for that, and we look forward to hearing more from you. So the first segment we're going to dive into is compliance plus technology and plus a sector lens combined. So what does that look like? What does that mean, right? So I'm going to direct this towards Prakar, and thank you for joining us. Sorry you were late. I let everyone know, but I did introduce you. You just have to trust me that I did a good job. So Prakar, with InCorp, based on what you're seeing in the UAE, and even beyond, because Swati did mention kind of global multinational, but focusing on UAE, working out, what are companies currently prepared for in this law, right? Like what is the least prepared for this law, right? I guess. Does that make sense?
Yeah, Colin, and thank you for introducing me, and apologies for being delayed. There's some IT glitch which I was facing. Now, coming back to your question, I think most of the very important points which Swati already touched upon. Uh, right from sort of preparing for collecting the information, doing the calculations, using tech tools, and training the team. But I would also like to draw a bit of more attention towards how the compliance is also evolving. So I'll just sort of try to make it more wide with respect to the coverage. If you see the Middle East overall right now, the compliance structures with respect to ESGs are shaping at a very fast pace. So although in UAE right now we are seeing there is a mandate which has come up on which is on Decree 11 right now, which is talking about measuring your emissions and then doing the audits and validations. But from a larger perspective, I think the struggle is more from a start perspective, which you said we should start early.
Mhm.
So I think most of the companies which pick the ESG disclosures for the first time uh, uh, either do it in hurry and sort of see it like a checkbox exercise, which is usually not the case. So once, for example, in case of Decree 11, also the data is will go digitized. So there is a portal which is launched by UAE authorities, and that portal is already live now, which asks you to submit the data on the portal. So which means you're also sort of putting something out in the market for larger set of stakeholders. So it is not just only the compliance which will get impacted, it will also the other stakeholder which will be assessing your data. So tomorrow, for example, that data might be exposed to your suppliers, your customers for taking different sort of decisions, which is happening in the mature markets. So the markets like, for example, India or in Europe or USA, what is happening is already they have crossed these stages and now they are into the zone wherein they're utilizing this data for better compatibility, better marketability, and sort of also improving the value chain scenarios across the board. So, although right now the compliance impact, which is persistent, is the duty of there is a penalty of around 5,000 50,000 to 2 lakh, or sorry, 20 lakh AED, which is because of the breach of climate change laws and duties, which can impact if some of these things are not onboarded on time. So that's a broader perspective, which I thought I would like to bring in before we move and deep dive into the other aspects of the elements of it.
No, thank you. Appreciate you setting it up that way. And we obviously we value your insights. You guys are in this all day, every day, and seeing a lot of different things. If Quran, Swati, do you guys agree? Do you see gaps in different places or any like add-on? I would normally say ladies first, but she just did a really great keynote, so maybe I'll tee it up to Karan first.
Sure, Colin. No, I think I agree with a lot of what Prakhar said. And in terms of, as you sort of stated, right, on companies that might be least prepared or areas that they might be least prepared, I don't think unpreparedness is uniform, right? But if you really have to sort of drill down and look at, let's say weak spots or open areas across companies, especially with interactions with a lot of firms that we've had in the UAE, right? I think the highest would be entity level visibility, right? Because majority of organizations, especially the larger ones, right, don't really have a clear map of which assets, facilities, business units are actually even within the scope of regulation, right? Especially those that fall under joint ventures or have free zone operations, right? So unless the boundary setting and considerations are sort of done from day one, reporting can become highly inconsistent, right? So it's very important to solve for that. I also believe data governance, right, and evidence trails is something that companies aren't currently prepared for. And Swati spoke about this when she sort of said, right, where the utility bills lie. Are they with HR? Are they with finance? Who's responsible for what? And this is a serious concern, right? Because today, most of the data that really goes into your emission calculations and GHG accounting, like lives in spreadsheets, PDFs, right? Sometimes even emails, right? And there's lack of accountability and record for who submitted it, when the data was updated, what has changed over time in that specific data point, right? Because there's no traceability, and that becomes a compliance risk very quickly, especially if you're going in for a third party auditor assurance. Right. Another thing that's fairly important to consider, right, is also supplier engagement, right? Because companies that are still at the stage of sort of sending out questionnaires, hoping for replies of their suppliers, right, will have a very, very different relationship with the decree now, right? Because with mandatory reporting, that relationship really needs to become structured, right? So building in these sort of considerations in your contracts, SLAs, right? Validation of your suppliers, and not really have a voluntary survey system that's easy to sort of abate, right? So for me, the biggest readiness gap is just systematic, right? So we're trying to assemble data retroactively instead of capturing it at source, which becomes very, very important. And I think that's sort of the larger gap that I see in terms of unpreparedness for UAE companies.
Awesome. Thank you. Anything you want to add, Swati, or your own gap takeaway?
Yeah, no, I think it's pretty much been covered by Prakhar and Karan. I think the other thing that I would probably, and I touched upon a little bit of this earlier, I think the other thing would be that accountability piece ends up being quite siloed.
Yeah.
So I think that needs to be brought together a little bit more consciously. I think we're conscious about what is it that we're trying to achieve here, and I think that's going to be quite critical. But I think completely agree with everything that Prakhar and Karan have said. The one thing that I would probably add here is global companies versus local companies. In fact, global companies versus their local offices here. So if we look at multinational organizations, they have a mandate to report to the global sustainability head within the company. And all of the data that gets fed into the global organization then is reported centrally at
Yeah.
the global central company level, right? But what are the implications? And this would be something good to unpack. And this is just food for thought. I'm not saying anybody has necessarily an answer. Maybe we do. But what are the implications of these regional offices for these global organizations? And what is the level of compliance that they need to adhere to, despite the fact that they do this at a global level, right? So I think that will be very interesting to see in terms of understanding, in terms of a gap of do we need to do this and that, which means somewhat of a duplication. But again, if we go back to the digital tools at our disposal, that duplication is not necessarily as intense as we would imagine, because there's a system, there's a platform that's doing it for you, within which you're feeding information in any case. And it's easy to kind of extract that for a particular country once that information goes in. And then I think, Karan, you brought up a very interesting point around supply chain gap as well, right? So I
Yeah.
think that will be quite critical for companies that are on their net zero journey. Because when we look at the net zero ambitions and the net zero strategies, it needs to be across our value chain, where our
Yeah.
supply chain becomes excessively critical, because unless we're able to solve for that, we're unable to actually comply with the net zero ambitions that have been set. So I think just a few things to keep in the back of the mind if companies are not necessarily at the stage of defining their net zero ambitions. That's perfectly fine. But if that's something that comes up in the next 12 to 18 months as a company, then that's something to kind of, think about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Prakar, was there any like a final thought you wanted to add to this before we move on? But that was a lot of great content.
No, I think largely covered all the points, and there's some interesting things which probably we can build on while we continue the webinar.
Awesome. Well, if you didn't catch it earlier, don't wait till the last moment. The sense of urgency, and I really like the Karan brought it up. Swati reiterated. You don't just rely on generalities or just the standards that are out there. You really need to know your business and know your role and how it affects and impacts up and downstream, and in what the actual roles and requirements and regulations are. Don't just do a Google search and hope you get it right.
Yeah.
Awesome. This is wonderful. Thank you guys. So we're going to move into the next segment. So this one is focused on like data and emissions reporting. It was already alluded to about spreadsheets, silos, hopes and prayers. That can't be the answer. So we're going to start it off with Karan.
Uh-huh.
So measuring scope 1 and 2, and as we scale into scope 3, um, it's a big shift, right? It's a massive undertaking. So what's the biggest barrier that companies are facing in getting reliable data, in your opinion?
Yeah, Colin, absolutely. And you're right. It is a major shift, right? And until now, as Swati again stressed upon earlier, that ESG reporting, including emissions reporting previously in the UAE, was largely voluntary, right? So companies did it occasionally, right? It was in the form of PowerPoints or a couple of spreadsheets as a best effort exercise.
Mhm.
But now with mandatory annual scope 1, scope 2, select scope 3 reporting, right? The expectation is precision, traceability, auditability, right? Rather than just being a best effort exercise. So the biggest barrier to this is that data doesn't simply live in one place, right? So if you categorically break down scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions, there itself you have a lot of silos where you have to procure data from. So your scope 1 data will be sitting with mainly operations, right? Your fuel consumption, your refrigerants, fugitive emissions, on-site equipment that you have to monitor. Your scope 2 is probably lying, with EHS, finance, procurement, right, across utility invoices. Again, the larger question of who that accountability goes to can differ from company to company. And then scope 3 is a massive ocean, right? So it's spread across your suppliers, logistic partners, waste vendors, employees, right? If you're in the real estate business, then you're looking at your leased assets. If you're in manufacturing, then you have different considerations as well. So when sustainability teams are asked to report emissions, right? They're often the last mile, right? So they are responsible for numbers that they are not generating, right? Because those numbers are generated from different departments and different verticals within the particular business, right? Which leads to, I think, largely three practical challenges, right? One is fragmented systems of data management. So you have your PDF spreadsheets, portals, bills, right, that don't speak to each other, right? So the data points that you have to track are not interlinked, right? The departments that you have to collect this data from are not interlinked, which leads to the second problem of unclear ownership, right? So there's no single accountability for accurate activity data. And I think the third is it's just that it's a retroactive measurement that you end up doing at the end of the year, right? And we see this very, very often, right? Where if a company has to disclose their emissions or put out a sustainability report in, let's say, January, right? Or let's say, in this case, you're looking at probably May, right? There's a 2, 3 month period before they actually have to report when they wake up. And that makes processes really difficult, right? Because they start measuring this data annually, long after decisions are made when they should be actually tracking this data at least on a monthly basis, right? Or a quarterly basis. So when reporting becomes mandatory and subject to penalties, that approach creates a lot of risk. And I think Prakhar would probably be able to emphasize on the risk aspect much better than I can, right? But the mindset shift that's required is emissions data needs to be treated the same way that you treat financial data, captured at source, right? Validated fairly regularly, right? And stored and tracked in a system of record. Because again, remember, within the Decree 11 regulation itself, you're looking at maintaining this data track record for the previous 5 years of reports, right? So if I'm putting out a report for Decree 11 in 2030, I'm still going to have a system of record for my data from 2025, right? So you have to build consistent data models. You have to have clear roles and governance, right? You need to have digital automation wherever possible, right? And once that foundation is set, then sure, right? Calculations become fairly simple. So the barrier to emission calculations is capability, right? And it's a data maturity challenge. It's not an emission calculation challenge, right? The moment data flows cleanly, emission calculations is fairly simple.
Wonderful. Thank you, Karan. Prakar, what from in InCorp, from a compliance perspective, what are you guys seeing and how are you seeing it show up with this barrier that Karan just mentioned? And then also maybe you can dovetail that into or tie it into risk mitigation as well.
So sure, I'll cover it from two primary lenses. I think most of the problems which Karan has already identified, there are two problems which usually you see from a compliance and then from an assurance lens, because both of these has to be covered eventually. The first step, which most of the companies who are doing it for the first time misses, is setting up a clear boundary. And this can happen at multiple stages. Let's say, for example, most of the companies believe that emissions are coming and generating largely from their plants and production facilities. And during identification stages, they miss the facilities like, for example, warehouses, like, for example, stores, like, for example, as good as guest houses, and then facilities which are within the premises, and so on and so forth. So the first point and the perspective which has to be clearly set out is all locations has to be clearly identified and monitored. So the boundary setting is very important from a locational perspective. Also, secondly, the boundary setting is very important from a legal entity perspective. So when you are talking about a legal entity, let's say, for example, you have multiple subsidiaries, you might have operations outside India, outside UAE, you have operations outside the local region you have, and you have created multiple entities for that. So the company needs to be very clear with respect to their reporting boundary as well from a legal entity perspective, because that can also impact the transactions, that can impact the flow of the information and the emission calculations at the local stages. So I think that is one of the primary element of boundary setting exercise, which has to be extensive. Uh, the second aspect of this is once you jump into, let's say, I have a clear boundary now, wherein I have identified locations, I have identified legal entities. I might have to also go a bit detail into the transactional aspect of the stories that can happen based on sector to sector. Let's say, for example, something like a real estate sector, which does a lot of subleasing activities, wherein they are leasing out their assets to the tenants, and then tenants are operating on those assets. Now, the electricity is common as used as a common pool, let's say, for example, in a mall, and then it is then distributed to these tenants. So how do you account for it also depends on how legally you are binded in terms of your contracts, how in terms of your transactions on ground. So that is also the secondary aspect. So primary, although you set up the boundary, the secondary aspect for each category you might have to also go deeper, understanding the transaction and understanding the nitty-gritties of whose books are getting hit, which financial are getting it, and so on and so forth. So that is from a identification perspective. And then what Karan rightly said, that there's a lot of training elements which comes in, and then you have to handle people, because data is flowing from multiple stakeholders within the organization. So you are literally talking about integrating data from supply chain, human resource, EHS. Certain data also flows from financials and so on. So once you are calculating scope 1, 2, 3, you are integrating so many different departments within the organization, which is itself is a challenge in itself. Now, when it comes to an assurance lens, which is what I mean, because we are seeing it from both ends, when you come it from an assurance lens, the assurance usually starts drilling down from the financial elements aspect. So they will try and correlate your invoices. So essential backups needs to be maintained. They will also see these transactional structures which you have created, boundaries which you have created. They will also be questioning you on how are you noting back some of these items, like, for example, scrap. If waste is one of the categories in scope 3 and you are reporting waste, they might be questioning you that how have you
Yeah.
disposed this waste. If you have disposed, you would have paid something or you would have received something. Both the scenarios can be possible. If it's a hazardous waste, you are paying it for disposal. If it's a non-hazardous waste and recyclable, you might be getting some money when you're selling it for the recycling purposes. So they will be going in those layers wherein they will try and maintain and manage both your data on ESG platforms and the financials data, which we call it as connected sustainability, basically. So it is not divided. All the transactions should marry eventually. And one of the beautiful point which Karan mentioned is that we should see it like a financial transaction book, wherein every time you book a financial, you should also book its consumption at the same stage. So that can probably help companies to resolve some of these issues.
Okay, thank you. That was awesome. That's a lot of doom and gloom for this segment. Karan, did you want to leave them with a little hope, a little nugget of joy, happiness? Because of technology, how we can bridge this gap, or do you want to just let them hang till the end?
No, absolutely. No, I mean, there are a lot of problems we can solve with tech, right? Which I think the largest one with respect to these markets would be dealing with a lot of unstructured data. But at the end of the day, right, bullshit in is bullshit out. So it becomes fairly important for them to ensure that data accuracy and accountability is there across all teams. Because even with the best tech solutions, if the data isn't clean, right, and isn't structured, it's very, very difficult to get the right results.
100%. Thank you. So that's it for that segment. Wow. Moving on. Segment C, workforce and sector readiness. Swati, I'm coming to you first. So, with your experience, what sectors, verticals, or even you mentioned silos inside a company. So, what teams, what divisions are likely to struggle most with capability and skills?
Thanks. I'm glad I wasn't part of the doom and gloom section.
Yeah, I wanted to keep
it. But jokes aside, I think there's an argument to be made for every single industry and what its contribution is towards emissions, right? In terms of sector readiness, I would say, given the fact that we're in the UAE, I think one of the highest impact sectors, in my opinion, would potentially be construction and real estate, right? So construction is a highly, at this point in time in our lives, and it's going through a transition, but it's not the most sustainable industry to be in, because the elements that go into construction are highly unsustainable, right? And given the growth that we've seen in the UAE, and I've been in this country for the last 18 years, I mean, what I have seen, we've obviously all kind of been through that and continues to grow, right? So I think that would be a good focus to look at the construction and real estate industry and how they can kind of tailor all of that, right? Manufacturing is a big one, right? We're talking about byproducts, we're talking about waste, we're talking about resource consumption in terms of production. We're talking about emissions that come out of production plants as well. So I think manufacturing is a very, very big one as well. And obviously, then you start going down into a little bit more detail, and then you start talking about, well, within manufacturing, what products are we talking about? And then it gets super specialized, right? Because that also changes when you get sort of sector sub-specific as well. A slight no-brainer, I would say, would be logistics, transportation. We're talking about how they operate. And I was having a conversation a few weeks ago, and somebody happened to mention that, we were struggling with during the Red Sea issue that we had. We were struggling with products getting into the country, and so instead of obviously sea freight that we used to use to ship our products, we switched to land and air. And right there, it makes you take a pause. And my question to this person was, at any point in time, when this strategic decision was being made, was there a person who raised the fact that this would be a massive impact on your emissions? Was there anyone bringing that? Whether you took that decision that way or the other, irrelevant. Was there someone who brought that up? And I think that's where, slightly digressing here, but that's where we go back to kind of having the conversation about sustainability moving and evolving from a reporting function to a strategic function, to have a seat at the table where decisions are made, to be able to bring up certain issues. So logistics, I think, is obviously a massive one. energy,
Those
hospitality.
are some good verticals. How about within the teams themselves? Maybe do you
Yeah,
see any departments that might excuse themselves from the conversation or might accidentally not be invited, but they're also part of that because of the role they play internally? Because again, you mentioned earlier the silos, and
yeah.
it's just so common. Do you see any particular teams that seem to struggle to get started? And that's the main thing here, right? Just get started. Doesn't
Yeah.
matter where you are today. Just get started. So that way you can build up a roadmap to success. But
Yeah.
any thoughts on particular people or teams or roles that might struggle?
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, the ideal answer here, Colin, would be that we're all responsible for what we do from an emission standpoint, right? That's the ideal answer.
Yes.
Is it the most practical answer? Not really. So I think I would say for an organization that isn't necessarily quite adept with sustainability, and I'm not trying to be, again, not to bring in the doom and gloom, but I think every single function would be slightly clueless because they wouldn't know what this means. Because
Yeah.
Historically, there's been a Swati or there's been a Karan or there's been a Prakhar or there's been a Colin that's been driving sustainability, and it's kind of sat with them. But to Karan's point, that data hasn't sat with us. We've had to go and source that data. So I would say finance is a very, very critical player, right? And again, everything that Karan's already mentioned, right? So procurement is a very, very important conversation, is a key stakeholder, in fact. Supply chain is a very key stakeholder. We're talking about operations being a key stakeholder.
Sure.
Would any of these be more adversely impacted than another? I mean, that would completely depend upon the sustainability journey of that organization and how integrated sustainability is within the organization. So if you have conversations with your finance departments already to say, look, this sits with you. I need this information at this point in time. Please provide it to me. They're already in tune with what the expectation is. Similarly, a conversation with procurement might go something like, well, we don't actually own any data points. What do you want from us? Well, we need to start looking at our contracts with our vendors and start integrating sustainability into that. Are those conversations happening? Because you also need to make your stakeholders within the organization understand what their role is towards that end goal. If they don't understand it, they're not going to buy into it. So I think every stage has its own complication. I don't know if that kind of, I
No,
know that's not a very clear cut answer, but yeah.
that's a good answer because it actually will bring in Prakar and Karan as well, right? Prakar from a risk mitigation, from a go forward strategy session, how to get better, right? You could see where this is a natural conversation starter. Karan from a tech, from an interconnectivity, from a centralized control tower, having actionable, auditable data ready now. Do you guys want to add something to kind of put a bow on what Swati said?
So I think on a lighter note, I really want to add the person who will struggle the most would be the person who will be the compliance manager, because he will have a deadline pressure building on him as we grow closer to the deadline, and that's
Is
just
that
seen
because
with
everyone does whatever they want and then they just throw it
yes.
on their desk and say, make sure that we
So
don't get
he's
in
the one
trouble?
who needs support the most, first
Okay.
of all, I mean, in terms of the struggle. But I also see the maturity more from not just from a sector perspective, definitely, which is what Swati has already covered. There are certain sectors which definitely requires more eyes and more lenses. But there is also a maturity from a stakeholder perspective, which we are seeing in the market. That there are certain sectors in which the stakeholders are very mature. Let's say, for example, uh, 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 a company like an IT sector, IT hub, and you are seeing a lot of companies who are pushing their supply chain partners in that whole value chain. Although they are not, if you ask a small IT company today whether they are emitting, the answer will be no from most of them. They believe that they are not emitting anything on ground, but there is a lot of maturity which has come in the overall industry because they have picked it up fast and they are now trying to pull in all the supply chain partners. So the maturity has to also be seen in from the perspective of stakeholder. What are your customers seeing today? What are your regulations building up in those countries and so on and so forth. So that also will push a bit more on the
No,
on the
that's great. I wanna close out that segment and then roll it right in with you, Prakar, into the last segment, right? How do we turn this we'll call it chaos? How do we turn it into this compliance and risk mitigation into opportunity?
Yeah.
So
So,
right now, everyone's just seeing that there's risk, there's potential penalties, there's all this nonsense. But what innovation, investments, operational efficiency, what do you see as ways for companies to kind of see the light through the end of the tunnel? They go, oh, here's what I could do.
yeah, there is definitely, and I was trying to sort of come to that point itself when I was saying bringing in the stakeholder and on the table, that the first and foremost thing you do is you are not just doing a compliance by doing all of these things. That is the primary point which the companies have to start focusing on. So, which brings in a lot of internal support. So, let's say, for example, if I go and make a conversion in a room full of department owners saying that I need some data just because there is a compliance deadline which is coming in, versus I will make a conversion that this will be a value addition to some of your stakeholders which you are dealing with. Let's say, for example, if you have an emission data available with you, now you can go and confidently talk to your customer saying that, see, my footprints are better than what as compared to someone else. That kind of
Right.
conversation will become automatically feasible and possible. So we have to start valuing the information within the organization from a stakeholder perspective rather than just from a compliance perspective. And if the companies are not doing it today, they will definitely has to do it 2 years, 3 years down the line. That's what the trend we are seeing in other mature industries. So that is the first thing which brings in a lot of positivity and sort of push within the room to do some of these things on ground. The other thing is more efforts on collaboration. So usually when we start some of these activities on ground, we ask teams to create a working level group within the organization. So pull in resources from different departments, which is the most critical departments on ground, and then create this working committee on ground, which can help in consolidating the information, because as we all know that it is all spread out right now. So this working committee or an ESG committee could be a good start point from a solutioning perspective. And then the data layer can be better improved with tech implementations on ground. So how do you pull tech, and then some of us can go and then train people there on ground, and then try and build this whole loop of better data and reducing down the risk, and also bringing a better perspective of what we are doing.
So do you want to add to that, Karan? Right, we're looking at Decree 11, the law,
Uh-huh.
regulations, lockdown. What opportunity is there for these companies?
No, so from an opportunity standpoint, I really think that when people think about sustainability, right, and probably a lot of folks on this call that have joined us as well, so to think of it as a cost center, right? But the opportunity really lies in the financial sort of benefits that come with doing sustainability, right? And while there's a lot, I think probably with the short time we have on our hands, I'll touch upon specifically on this from a financing perspective. Right. So most global banks today, right, as well as equity financiers and PE firms, are looking to invest in sustainable businesses, right? So you actually have access to instruments like sustainability linked loans, right? Green bonds that sort of come from the larger international banks. So your HSBC, your DBS, right? These kind of banks do offer financial instruments. But what really surprised me, right, is I was doing a little bit of reading for a client fairly recently in the UAE, and we found that local banks as well, right, have these instruments available already. So, for example, Emirates NBD, right, recently did a sustainability linked loan with Chalhoub Group, right? You have banks like Dubai Islamic Bank that have an entire financing framework built around sustainability. So you're able to actually get haircuts on debt, on borrowing, right? If you're able to show a track record of being a sustainable business and having sustainable considerations, right? Like as Swati said, when you're taking into account simple decisions, right? From changing from, let's say, shipping to air freight and land freight, right? Is somebody asking that question, right? If a company is able to display the fact that at least these questions are being raised because there's a governance framework, because ESG is being built into those policies, that's all we're asking for as a first step, right? And that will give you access to a lot more financially as well.
Gotcha. Did you want to add anything, Swati?
Yeah, I think no, Prakhar and Gagan have covered most of everything, but I would
Perfect.
maybe just add very quickly. I think the softer side to this is beyond compliance. When you look at the opportunity that this holds, goes a little bit around brand building as well, right? So it also gives you, in some respects, a license to operate in the new world, right? It gives you that license to operate. It gives you that authentication. It also is something that's top of mind for the next generation of employees out there in the world, right? The new generation getting into, or even the generation slightly sort of above them who've been coming in, we've seen this pattern now for the last 15 odd years, that fresh graduates or anybody getting into the workforce is interested in working for organizations that are more sustainable. That's one of the criteria that they look for, not just for a certain amount of money, not just for a big brand name or a multinational organization, not just for a team that they're likely to be happy in, but they want to work for an organization that has sustainability at the core of their operations, where the ethos are in line with what they do. So I think that's very critical when we're looking at at this from also an opportunity to attract the right talent within the organization, right? And I think that will be quite critical in that shift in getting the right people to deliver the right messages and the products that you want to. And I think, Prakhar, I think you touched upon this, and I think this was very interesting for me. Was kind of creating these pockets of committees, right? So it's kind of how do we get together? How do we have that conversation? And that's a great way to do this. A lot of companies do this a little bit more informally as well. I would probably take that a step further, right? I'm a big propagator of the SDGs, and the biggest one for me, and one must never have a favorite, but I do. My favorite is goal number 17, which is basically coming together, right? So how partnerships for a better tomorrow. So how can we come together, even if that is industry specific companies coming together and kind of having these communities or roundtable conversations to try and understand, look, this is my understanding of what needs to be done, but that I'm not quite sure if I'm right here, and somebody else, says, well, my legal team has advised us on X, Y, and Z. But I think that shared platform, that shared knowledge is going to help everyone kind of take this to the next level. So there's a little bit of an opportunity that kind of work together as opposed to always work in competition as well.
Beautiful. So real quick, because we're coming up on time, I want each of you to give a brief kind of a one-liner vote of confidence to those in attendance. What's the single most important action that UAE companies should take in the next 90 days? We'll just start with Prakar.
I think start building firm teams and start building capabilities in terms of understanding what is required, prepare a plan, and then start taking action on it.
Beautiful. Karan?
Agreed. Map emission boundaries, identify your data owners, have accountability, right? I think that's what you can fix in 90 days. Take it forward from there.
Okay, and we started with Swati, so we'll finish with Swati.
Yeah, I would say start collecting your data and start setting your baseline. I think that's going to take you forward.
Excellent, thank you. So we're gonna go through some questions that came in, and while I'm pulling those up, we're gonna put something on the screen for networking, contact information, ways that people can connect professionally. I encourage this. Build out your network. I think you heard the word partnership. Partnership comes in a lot of different forms. It's really important to have a community because we're all in this together, interdepartmentally. Companies that you might not even know you're affiliated with, but everyone has the same challenges. So don't try to go at this alone. Really encourage outreach, making connections. So while they're pulling that information up for you on the screen, I am going to start with the question. Now, none of these questions were directed towards a specific person, so if you think you're best suited to answer it succinctly, maybe we'll start with whoever chimes in first. So the first question says, once the disclosures are complete, how should firms convert climate data into strategic decisions that strengthen resilience and competitiveness in the UAE? Any takers? Or they don't want me to make up an answer, so
Yeah, I think Swati or Prakhar are probably better suited to do
probably.
this.
What do you got,
I think
Prakar? Come on. Oh, Swati, yeah, here we go.
maybe if I have a quick go at it, and I'll hand it over to Prakar, who'll probably have a little bit more value to add to this. But I think climate data into strategic actions is essentially what is critical to making that shift, like I mentioned very early on, right? That's critical to making that shift from this being a reporting function to being a strategic conversation. Going back to my earlier conversation, sustainability needs to have a table at the decision-making tables, be it with the leadership teams, be it with the board. When a critical decision like changing your shipment from sea freight to air freight happens, who is challenging that decision? So it's all well and good that you've got your climate data, you've reported, you've got a decarbonization strategy. But when it comes to when the buck stops at making money versus mitigating emissions, what call are you taking, right? And I think that's what it all boils down to. So who's in that team, who's at that table challenging the decision maker, saying, yes, we're going to make a little bit more money, but look at the impact we're going to have on the emissions. So and I think over time that's going to come across. I think that's going to come across in the conversations we have at large, etc., and will eventually convert into that competitive edge.
Yeah, I think
Thank
Swati
you.
beautifully touched upon it, and I think we were discussing about partnerships a while ago. Here, I mean, talking about SDG 17. So I think one of the critical elements which bridges this gap between climate data and strategic decision making is also finding a right partner. So that right partner could be, let's say, a customer, which is saying that no, don't worry, we both will cross this journey. There are some changes which you have to take on ground, we will support you there, and there are several companies right now in the market which are doing it. Like, for example, Walmart runs a very beautiful supply chain engagement program wherein they're funding the suppliers to make some of these changes on ground. So it is not that every time that it's the decision stops only at you. It is also about identifying the right partner for that. So it could be, let's say, in certain cases, authorities, government authorities like waste management and all. There are several instances where we have seen the government authorities participate and then co-build a solution or an innovation which can help you to cut down on your emissions. So I think that is also one of the critical elements which has to be seen in while you are taking that decision.
Perfect. Thank you. So what's the next one? How can organizations align their Decree 11 reporting with global frameworks such as TCFD, ISSB, CSRD to avoid siloed compliance work?
I can address this a little bit and probably get Swati or Prakhar to add to it. But to answer it fairly quickly, right, a lot of these frameworks, global frameworks, have overlapping disclosures, right? So a lot of the data points that you are collecting to report across them are fairly common. You're tracking energy, you're tracking your emissions, you're looking at a couple of social metrics that sort of come under consideration, couple of governance metrics, right? So it's more or less an alphabet soup of frameworks, but the data, in a sense, is very, very similar, right? So as long as we're able to solve the data challenge, right, reporting cross framework is fairly simple, especially if you're using technology solutions very similar to ours, right, where we're able to directly map out the data, save you almost weeks of work by having to actually map those data points in the right format for that particular framework and allow you to report it. So if you're reporting across a fairly widespread reporting framework, let's say something like a GRI, especially if you're doing, let's say, in accordance with report for a GRI, right? You should be able to comply with most global frameworks with the data you're collecting and managing for that itself.
Yeah, I like that. And that leads into the next question I'm looking at here. So beyond compliance, what baseline data should every organization be collecting today, right? And how does early data maturity prepare them for future regulations and transition planning? It's a good question. Who wants to add a little color to that?
Yeah, maybe if I can just maybe very quickly touch upon this. I think what we've spoken a lot about today is the environmental piece of it, right? We haven't looked at the social impact data at all. But when you consider ESG as a whole, and when you look at reporting, the social impact element of it is quite critical. Even the governance piece of it is quite critical. So I think those are some of the things I would encourage companies to start looking into as well. So obviously baseline and more often than not, a large chunk of the media conversation ends up happening around emissions because they're more tangible, right? It's tangible. You've got the numbers. You understand where it's going, what the decarbonization strategies can kind of implement. But we often forget what the social impact side of ESG looks like. Also, like I said, the governance piece of it, right? And elements of that are ethics, compliance, diversity, inclusion, all of these elements. And what are you doing on that? I think that would be a good kind of, if you're looking to expand beyond what's the bare minimum, which I definitely think everyone should, I think that's the path you should probably consider.
Wonderful. Anyone want to add to that?
No, I
No?
think that was good.
So the next two questions are pretty straightforward. So the first one is there a threshold for which companies this decree applies to? I know there is, but does someone want to kind
Yeah,
of let
there
them
is
know
a
what it applies?
definition of sources which is mentioned in the decree 11 itself. So this is a defined term which says that all the public and the private limited company, which all irrespective if they are operating in the free zones also, this will be applicable. Only thing is that the list of such companies has to be officially notified so by the local municipalities. So that is right now in progress. What UAE market is right now seeing.
Yeah, I know we're a little bit over. We'll take one last question here. Are there any specific reduction targets given to companies? So are they given specific targets?
I don't think so. They have any targets which they have set up right now.
No, so
Yeah,
yeah, I think if I may add, while there are no specific targets, the Decree 11 does tie into the UAE Net Zero 2050 ambition, right? So I think down the line, there's definitely an expectation of sharing reduction strategies as part of the regulation. Right. But I think targets should come down the line as part of this regulation. It just differ industry by industry, sector by sector, or might even differ depending on company size. But as of now, no, there's no absolute clarity or target that's been set.
Yeah, but I think
I
also,
think
I completely agree. I think also what ends up happening is we're going step by step. So the first step is figuring out where you stand. And the next step would be to then create a strategy to then reduce emissions. The third step would be then kind of going a step beyond that. So we're still at step one right now. The targets will come. And I think we can all collectively agree that that is the natural next step for to happen. But at this point in time, it's just about reporting. It's just about figuring out what your baseline is, and then taking that step to kind of create that 20% reduction target, 50% reduction target, whatever it might look like.
That's a great point,
No,
Swati, because we've seen that in different regions of the world, right? Whenever they come out with a regulation, it's, hey, just give us some general information, and then you fast forward 3 years, and they're really starting to drill down, getting specific, and the fines are getting hammered. So that's a good point. You're just getting started. Reach out to some professionals, digitize, organize as much as possible, seek help from professionals to give you that guidance, and at least you're on the right path. You might take some lumps along the way, but at least you're on the right path and you're moving in the right direction. And then, like Swati just said, as they start to add things to it, you'll already have your legs under you, so you'll be able to figure it out a lot faster than just burying your head in the sand and hoping that it goes right past us. So
Yeah,
I
no,
think, yeah. Oh, you want to add some final thought, Karan?
no, I was just agreeing with you and Swati, and I was just adding that it makes a lot of sense because you can't manage something that you can't measure, right? So it only makes sense that the first bit of the regulation is to start measuring, and then I think we'd see a lot in terms of the management perspective as well.
Yeah. Well, that concludes today's festivities. Thank you to the three of our super esteemed panelists. Thank you to all who attended. Thank you, InCorp, for setting this up. And thank you for allowing me to moderate. And I apologize that you had to put up with me, but it was fun. And I learned a lot. And I've been doing this for a while. So hopefully those of you online that I did not get to say hello to, hopefully you learned a lot as well. And hopefully you'll reach out to us, and we look forward to talking to you and helping you on your journey. So thank you, and everyone have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, and thank
Thanks,
you,
Colin.
Swati. Thanks.
Thanks, Karan,
Thank you.
Prakhar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.